Sir, please, don't go to that meeting. A desperate warning from a maid no one believed. What unfolds is a breathtaking tale of betrayal, love, and a secret that could destroy everything. Are you watching from your couch, your commute, or late at night in bed? Drop a comment with your location and rate this emotional roller coaster from 0 to 10. Let's begin. The early spring sun poured through the stained glass windows of Whitmore Estate, casting colored shards across the polished marble floor like a cathedral of wealth. The grand chandelier, a cascade of Austrian crystal, hung silently over the foyer, like a reminder of old money and older secrets. Here, in this palatial fortress, tucked away in the hills of Virginia, power didn't need to raise its voice. It whispered in the walls, echoed in the footsteps of men who signed deals worth billions before breakfast and wore silence like a crown. But in one quiet hallway, kneeling beside a brass bucket of soapy water, Juliette Morgan muttered to herself, "You again, Floor. We meet every morning and still, you never surrender." Juliette's blonde hair was pinned into a messy twist, with strands stubbornly escaping to cling to her damp forehead. Her gray maid's uniform hung loosely from her shoulders, the cheap fabric a stark contrast to the gold-trimmed columns and imported tapestries around her. She rubbed harder, watching her reflection stretch and distort across the marble, thinking, not for the first time, that floors were like dreams. The shinier they got, the more people walked all over them. Once, not long ago, Juliette had stood at the front of lecture halls at the University of Pennsylvania, dazzling her professors with lightning-fast economic models and razor-sharp logic. But life had barged in with an unpayable hospital bill, and suddenly, she was no longer a rising star on Wall Street's horizon. Just a girl with a mop and a grandmother who needed heart surgery. The estate had a quietness that didn't come from peace, but from precision. Nothing creaked here, not a floorboard or a hinge, as if the house itself understood that wealth hated surprises. Juliette, however, brought her chaos, silent, internal, but ever-burning. When her phone buzzed in her apron pocket, she flinched, then fished it out with wet fingers. A message from the hospital. "Medication costs rising. Please confirm if you can cover this month." She swallowed hard, wiped the screen clean with her sleeve, and typed back 2 words she didn't believe. "I'll manage." Then, with a forced smile, she whispered, "Maybe I should sell a kidney. Or 2, get a discount." Her laughter was dry and short-lived. As she wrung out her rag and pressed it against a stubborn scuff mark, the rhythmic click of leather shoes echoed behind her. Her heart skipped before she even turned. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Preston Whitmore, the estate's cold-hearted master, was the kind of man whose presence arrived before his voice. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal suit cut so sharp it could slice the tension in a room, he walked like he owned every square inch of air he breathed. No delays," he said into his phone, not glancing at her as he passed. "If the numbers aren't on my desk by 5, consider the entire Dubai team terminated." The sound of his voice was ice over metal, calculated, unshaken. Juliette bowed her head, clutching her bucket like a shield. "Yes, sir," she mumbled under her breath once he was gone, her sarcasm just loud enough for the floor to hear. "I'll make sure it sparkles before you fire the entire planet." She watched his retreating back, her eyes narrowing, trying to reconcile the monster from corporate legends with the man she had just seen. Cold, yes, but human. There were rumors, of course, that he hadn't smiled since his father's funeral, that he ran Whitmore Financial like a war camp, that he believed emotions were for the poor. But Juliette didn't believe in monsters, only people hiding behind masks. The hallway darkened slightly as a cloud passed overhead, and with it came the sound of brisk footsteps. Mrs. Halden, the head housekeeper, appeared like a thunderclap in sensible heels. "Juliette, that staircase better be spotless before tonight's event," she snapped, clutching a clipboard like a weapon. Juliette straightened, lifting her bucket with both hands. "Yes, ma'am. But what event is it, if I may ask? Are we hosting another charity gala for people who don't believe in taxes?" Her smile was bright, her tone teasing. Mrs. Halden tried to look stern, but her eyes twitched with amusement. "It's a business reception. Nothing that concerns maids. Keep your head down." As the housekeeper walked away, Juliette stood frozen for a moment, gazing down the marble staircase that spiraled into the opulent main hall below. Business reception, she thought, biting her lip. For people like him, every reception is a battlefield in a tuxedo. And yet, something gnawed at her. A sense that this night might be different, that something important, irreversible, was already in motion. She descended the stairs slowly, humming the lullaby her grandmother used to sing when the world felt too heavy. In a mansion carved out of control and order, Juliette Morgan carried the chaos of the human heart like an ember in her chest. She had no idea that this ember would soon become a wildfire, and Preston Whitmore, the man with ice in his eyes, would be the first to burn. The next afternoon, the sky above Whitmore Estate hung heavy with rain clouds, and inside Preston Whitmore's private office, the air was thick with silence, broken only by the low hum of the climate control system. Juliette moved cautiously, dusting the mahogany shelves that lined the east wall, careful not to disturb the color-coded folders and pristine glass frames. The office was immaculate, like its owner, but Juliette's gaze kept drifting to the massive walnut desk in the center. Papers were neatly stacked, labeled with aggressive titles like Asset Seizure, Halberd Holdings, and Merger Path, Q2 Execution. She had no intention of snooping, but curiosity clung to her like the scent of lemon polish. She wiped the glass tabletop, her eyes catching on a document left partially exposed beneath a folder. The heading made her pause. Board meeting agenda, Halberd Capital Merger, 3 p.m. tomorrow, Manhattan HQ. Her brow furrowed. There was nothing unusual about a merger, but scribbled in red ink on the margin were the words, "Drop Whitmore stock 20% before the session. Secure vote." Juliette blinked. Her heartbeat began to rise, each thump syncing with the raindrops now hitting the tall windows behind her. A tactic like this, artificially crashing stock value before a vote, was more than unethical. It was a strategic ambush, a hostile play disguised in boardroom formality. She tried to shrug it off, telling herself it was probably some misunderstood note or a half-baked draft. But before she could move away, a crackle of static erupted from the desk phone. Someone had left it on speaker. A male voice, deep and composed, sliced through the silence. "Preston, keep the agenda tight tomorrow. We'll short Whitmore stock by noon. Media will run the downgrade by 2. And by 3, Halberd has full leverage. All you need to do is sign. We'll handle the rest." Juliette froze. She recognized that voice. She had heard it the night of the reception, when she was passing the terrace with a tray of champagne. Charles Halberd, CEO of Halberd Capital. She had dismissed his whispers as boardroom posturing, but now they felt like loaded weapons. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she stared at the phone, the margin note and the carefully crafted documents. Preston was walking straight into a trap. They weren't merging. They were being hunted. For a moment, she considered leaving it all alone. It wasn't her business. She was just the help. No one would believe her, especially not a man like Preston, who saw the world in columns and profit margins. But as her eyes scanned the charts, showing altered earnings predictions, numbers manipulated, something deeper than fear bloomed in her chest: integrity. She set the cloth down, her hands trembling. She reviewed the notes again, making sure she wasn't imagining things. Every page led to the same conclusion. Halberd was setting a noose, and Preston, whether through arrogance or ignorance, was walking right into it. 30 minutes later, she stood outside the conference room. Preston was inside, alone, reviewing reports before his next call. Her palms were slick, her mouth dry. She knocked once, then stepped in as the door creaked open. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, voice trembling but steady. "I need to speak with you. It's important." Preston barely looked up. "You're the maid," he said curtly, flipping another page. "Speak quickly." Juliette hesitated, then pushed forward. "I saw the merger proposal on your desk, the one with Halberd Capital, and I overheard Charles Halberd during the reception. They're planning to crash Whitmore's stock before the meeting and pressure you into signing a deal that benefits only them. The documents. Someone's doctored your earnings reports." "It's a setup, sir. You can't go to that meeting." Preston's eyes finally met hers, piercing and frigid, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You snooped through my documents, eavesdropped on my conversations, and now you're accusing my potential partners of fraud?" His voice was steel, his posture rigid. "Who exactly do you think you are?" Juliette's cheeks flushed, but she stood her ground. "Someone who studied economics at UPenn. Someone who knows what a hostile takeover looks like. I'm not lying. Your internal projections don't match the external forecast. Look at the margin notes. If you go tomorrow, you'll walk into a firestorm you don't control." Preston stood, stepping closer until she could feel the weight of his authority pressing into her. "You crossed a line," he said coldly. "You violated my privacy, overstepped your station, and now you're here, pretending to be a hero? Are you hoping I'll promote you? Or is this your way of selling this nonsense to my competitors?" Juliette's eyes burned, but she refused to look away. "I'm trying to help you," she said through clenched teeth. "And you're too arrogant to see the danger." The words hung between them like knives. Preston narrowed his eyes and said without a flicker of hesitation, "You're fired. Get out. Be gone within the hour." Juliette's throat closed, her heart cracking in half. She wanted to scream, to throw the documents at his feet and demand he see reason. But instead, she dropped the cloth in her hand, looked him straight in the eye and said, "When they take your company from you, don't say I didn't warn you." Then she turned and walked out with her head high, even as her vision blurred with tears. Outside, the rain had begun to fall in earnest, soaking the gravel drive as Juliette stepped through the iron gates of the estate for what she thought would be the last time. Her phone buzzed again, another hospital alert, and she laughed bitterly. "Perfect timing," she whispered. "I just lost the only job keeping her alive." But deeper than fear, deeper than anger, something inside her whispered, "You did the right thing." Whether or not it mattered was no longer in her hands. Tomorrow would decide everything. The 45th floor of Whitmore Financial's Manhattan headquarters buzzed with nervous people dressed in suits. Under the brutal glow of halogen lights, the boardroom felt less like a place of business and more like a battlefield. 12 men and women in $1,000 tailoring sat at the long table, their eyes shifting toward the head seat, where Preston Whitmore had just taken his place. The walls of glass surrounding them revealed a city cloaked in gray storm clouds, as if even the sky knew something was about to go wrong. In front of them, the digital stock ticker blinked like a time bomb. Whitmore stock was down 21% and still falling. Preston adjusted the knot of his navy blue tie, his expression unreadable. His gaze swept across the room, pausing momentarily on the display screen that showed a red-drenched chart of the day's market performance. The slide was steep, unnatural, and eerily aligned with the exact timing Juliette had warned him about. Her voice, raw and desperate, echoed in his memory. "They're planning to crash Whitmore's stock before the meeting." He clenched his jaw, forcing the thought back. No, He had fired her. She was just a maid, a girl with opinions, not facts. And yet, here they were. Charles Halberd sat directly across from him, a smile too polished to be real stretching across his face. "Tough day for your investors, Preston," he said lightly, sliding a folder across the table. "But that's the nature of business. Luckily, our deal cushions your losses. With this merger, your company stabilizes overnight, and Whitmore Financial joins a future-proof portfolio under Halberd Capital." The other board members murmured in agreement, nodding, flipping through pages of projections that looked glossy and convincing. But something was off. Preston's fingers tapped lightly on the edge of the folder, and he noticed the numbers. Too clean, too convenient. His father's voice rang in his head like a ghost. "When it looks too good, you're already being hunted." Preston opened the folder, scanning. The revenue forecast was identical to the summary his analysts had prepared, except for one key detail. The quarterly dip wasn't 11%. It was reported here as 18.7%. A small lie, unless multiplied over billions. His stomach twisted. He remembered Juliette saying, "The projections don't match. If you check, you'll see I'm right." He glanced up, and for the first time in the meeting, his icy demeanor cracked just enough to let something else through: doubt. "Charles," Preston said slowly, his voice as calm as a lake before lightning, "why does your team's report list Whitmore's quarterly loss at 18.7% when our verified internal report, dated 2 days ago, shows 11.3%? The room hushed. Charles blinked, chuckled, then waved a hand. "Come on, Preston. You know how market forecasts vary. It's noise. What matters is the big picture, the synergy. We can weather the storm together. Just sign and we're out of this mess before closing bell." But Preston didn't reach for the pen. Instead, he pressed a button on the table intercom. "Bring in the internal audit packet, full projection spread." The assistant appeared moments later with a thick blue folder, placing it beside Preston without a word. He opened it and flipped to page 17, then turned it toward the room. "Here, real numbers. This chart," he said, tapping it with 2 fingers, "shows a calculated short sell pattern that began at exactly 9:33 a.m., 20 minutes after Halberd Capital bought 10 million put options on our stock. That's not a coincidence. That's sabotage." Gasps filled the room. Charles stiffened, his smile faltering. "You're bluffing," he snapped, though his tone betrayed a flicker of panic. "You can't prove that." Preston leaned back slowly, the predator no longer feigning patience. "No," he said, "because my legal team can. As of this moment, our general counsel is drafting litigation for attempted hostile acquisition via market manipulation. And this meeting," he added, standing, "is over." Security entered quietly, though the weight of their presence was immediate. Preston didn't need to raise his voice or threaten further. His composure spoke volumes. Charles stood halfway, rage turning his face a violent shade of red. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. "Without this merger, Whitmore bleeds out." But Preston didn't flinch. "Then I'd rather bleed with honor than sell my company to a vulture in a silk suit." He walked out of the boardroom with the entire room watching in stunned silence, his steps steady, despite the earthquake he knew had just shaken his entire foundation. Down 23% in a day. Millions lost already. But somehow, it wasn't a disaster that echoed in his mind. It was a voice, shaking, furious, but right. "If you walk into that meeting blindly, you're going to lose everything." She had known. She had tried to warn him, and he had thrown her out like she was nothing. That night, Preston returned to his penthouse, overlooking the river, but the skyline no longer looked invincible. He sat at his desk, the internal audit folder still clutched in his hand. The last 6 hours played over in slow motion. The only reason he'd stopped the deal in time was because something inside him, the echo of that girl's words, had forced him to question what he saw. He thought of her face when she said, "I'm trying to save your company." And for the first time in years, Preston Whitmore felt the stinging weight of regret. He picked up his phone, staring at the blank screen, then set it down. He didn't even know where she'd gone, but he knew one thing now, with absolute clarity. Juliette Morgan wasn't just a maid. She was the reason Whitmore still stood, and he had to find her. No matter what it took. The rain hadn't let up in days. Manhattan's steel towers wept quietly beneath the gray sky, and Preston Whitmore stood motionless in his penthouse, staring out at the city he'd almost lost. He hadn't spoken to anyone all morning. The internal investigation was still ongoing, but the merger had been buried, and Halberd Capital was already backpedaling through legal channels. His board had offered hesitant praise, his investors had expressed cautious relief, and his lawyers had promised retaliation. But none of it mattered, not really. The only name that echoed in his mind was Juliette Morgan, and the memory of her voice, fiery and desperate, haunted every silence. She'd warned him. She'd risked everything, and he'd thrown her away like a stranger. It wasn't guilt alone that gnawed at him. It was something heavier, something sharp. Preston had spent his life being right, making decisions with clinical precision, trusting no one but numbers. But this time, he'd been blind, not by ignorance, but by arrogance. Juliette had seen the trap he hadn't. She'd challenged him when everyone else stayed silent. That kind of courage wasn't common. That kind of mind didn't belong behind a mop. He turned from the window, grabbed his phone, and called his head of security. "Find her," he ordered, his voice low and tight. "Juliette Morgan, former maid, worked at the estate. I want everything: address, background, schools, contacts. I don't care what it takes." Within 24 hours, the report landed on his desk, thick with information he hadn't expected and couldn't ignore. Juliette Morgan, 23 years old, top 5% in her economics program at the University of Pennsylvania, full scholarship recipient, published in academic journals before she was 20. Dropped out 2 years ago when her grandmother fell ill with congestive heart failure. No siblings. No surviving parents. Worked 2 jobs. Lived in a rent-controlled apartment in South Philadelphia. Her world had been crumbling, and still, she'd walked into his office to save his empire like it was nothing. Preston stared at her photo stapled to the top of the file, her blonde hair pulled back in a loose braid, her eyes wide and intelligent. "What the hell were you doing scrubbing my floors?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone. The next afternoon, he was in Philadelphia. His driver dropped him 3 blocks from her building, an aging brownstone sandwiched between a corner store and a bakery with peeling signage. Preston didn't bring his suit or his staff or the polished mask of the executive world. He wore a charcoal coat over a sweater, boots still damp from the sidewalk puddles. For once, he wanted to be just a man, not the empire he carried. He climbed the narrow stairs of the apartment building, his heartbeat climbing with each creak beneath his feet. The hallway smelled faintly of old toast and lemon cleaner. He found the door, 4B, and hesitated for only a second before knocking. Footsteps shuffled behind the door. Then it opened a crack, and Juliette appeared. No uniform, no bun, just a loose hoodie, tired eyes, and the expression of someone who hadn't slept in days. Her eyes widened when she saw him, and something unreadable flickered across her face. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice flat, her posture stiff. "You here to retrieve the rag I dropped on your floor?" Preston exhaled through a tight smile. "Juliette," he said, then raised a hand before she could close the door. "I owe you an apology." She didn't speak, just stood there, one hand on the doorframe, her shoulders squared as if bracing for a fight. "I was wrong not to listen," he continued, his tone stripped of its usual sharpness. The halberd meeting was a setup. Everything you said, it played out exactly as you warned. I nearly signed away the company my father built because I didn't trust you, and I fired you for trying to protect it. That's on me." She crossed her arms, her eyes cool. "So you came all this way to admit you were wrong?" Preston looked past her shoulder. The apartment was small but warm. A floral couch, photos on the wall, and in the corner, an elderly woman lay in a bed, asleep beneath a knit blanket. His voice softened. "I came because I found out who you are, you Penn. Top of your class. You gave up everything for her." He nodded toward the woman. "And still, you stood up to me when no one else dared. That kind of mind, that kind of strength, it belongs in a boardroom, not hidden behind a mop." Juliette blinked, clearly unprepared for the turn. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice quieter. Preston stepped back, letting his words settle in the air like a contract. "I want you to work for me, not as staff, as my strategic assistant. High salary, full benefits, flexible hours so you can care for her. You'll have real power, real say. I don't offer this lightly. I don't offer it at all usually." Juliette stared at him, her expression unreadable. She glanced back at her grandmother, then at the man in front of her, the same man who had humiliated her in a room full of silence. She laughed once, short and bitter. "Strategic assistant? You fired me for cleaning the wrong desk. Now I'm supposed to trust you with my future?" Preston didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for your trust. I'm asking for your judgment. You already saved my company once. I think you can do it again, this time with a title and a paycheck." For a long moment, nothing moved. Then Juliette looked down at her hands and sighed. "You're lucky I need the money," she muttered, her voice low. "And even luckier, I'm too stubborn to walk away from a challenge." She met his gaze with steel. "Fine, I'll take your offer. But if you ever talk to me like I'm disposable again, I'll burn your empire from the inside out." Preston's lips curved into the smallest of smiles. "Deal," he said simply, extending his hand. She didn't shake it, but she nodded once, and that was enough. Outside, the rain finally stopped. Inside apartment 4B, something had shifted. Not just in titles or job descriptions, but in trust, in respect, in the thin, dangerous thread of something beginning between two people who had once stood on opposite sides of the world. Preston left that night with a single thought burning in his chest. She didn't just save my company. She might be the only person who could save me. The 50th floor of Whitmore Financial pulsed with tension, strategy, and caffeine. 2 weeks had passed since Juliette Morgan stepped into the building not as a maid, but as Preston Whitmore's newly appointed strategic assistant. Gone were the gray cotton uniforms and scuffed sneakers. Now she wore a navy blue suit with sharp lapels and confidence to match. But underneath the tailored fabric and neatly tied hair, she was still Juliette, brilliant, stubborn, and irreverent in ways that had started to both infuriate and fascinate Preston. She walked into every meeting with an iPad in one hand and a mental library of financial frameworks in the other, her eyes flicking through charts as fast as others blinked. Preston had given her no easy welcome. He didn't hold her hand or offer comfort. Instead, he threw her into war zones disguised as boardrooms. The company was still reeling from the attempted hostile takeover, and opportunistic investors circled like vultures. Daily meetings were battles over share buybacks, international partnerships, and regulatory damage control. But Juliette held her ground, often in silence, sometimes in sarcasm, and always with insight, sharp enough to quiet rooms full of men who had never once listened to someone like her. Preston watched, sometimes amused, sometimes stunned, as she turned potential disasters into footholds. She wasn't just useful, she was necessary. One morning, Juliette stood at the edge of a tense conference table, eyes scanning a presentation slide showing a proposed deal with a Dubai investment fund. The CFO was arguing to sell 10% of Whitmore shares in exchange for immediate capital to recoup merger losses. Preston, seated at the head, had remained silent for most of the conversation, letting the board bicker and posture. Then, as if on cue, he looked at Juliette and said, "Miss Morgan, your thoughts?" All eyes turned. The room quieted as if someone had cut the oxygen. Juliette tapped the screen of her tablet once, then raised her gaze. "The Dubai fund seems generous, but their 2-year acquisition pattern suggests otherwise. They've taken control of 3 companies in under 24 months, using minority stake leverage. If we sell now, we'll be fighting to keep our own board seats by next fall. I propose a short-term debt facility from Morgan Bank instead. Yes, interest is higher, but it buys us time and control." Silence. Then, a low hum of murmurs, nods, and pages flipping. The CFO frowned but couldn't refute her logic. Preston leaned back slowly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Thank you, Miss Morgan," he said, then gestured for the discussion to continue. Juliette sat back in her chair, her pulse still racing, but her face remained composed. She whispered under her breath, "Okay, Lion's Den survived. For now." Preston heard her and fought the urge to laugh. She didn't realize she had just shifted the room's trajectory. Again. Late that evening, after the building had emptied and Manhattan's skyline glowed like 1,000 open windows into ambition, Juliette stayed behind in the boardroom, nursing a lukewarm coffee and rubbing the balls of her feet. She'd abandoned her heels hours ago and was now barefoot, her blazer tossed over a chair. Preston entered silently, holding a file in one hand, his tie loose, sleeves rolled. He raised a brow. "You always debrief barefoot?" Juliette glanced up and shrugged. "Only when I've walked 10 metaphorical miles over egos and missed lunch for the 3rd time in a row." He chuckled, setting the file down. "Your analysis today changed the direction of the firm's recovery strategy. You could have asked for steak. I'd have made it happen." Juliette arched a brow. "That's dangerously close to a compliment, Mr. Whitmore." He gave a small nod, not denying it. "Maybe it is." She leaned back, looking at him with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "You could have hired someone with a Wall Street resume a mile long. Why gamble on the girl who used to clean your floors?" Preston was quiet for a beat, then said, "Because none of them saw what you did, and none of them would have had the spine to tell me I was walking into a trap." His voice softened, not with sentimentality, but respect. "You remind me of what built this company in the first place, not titles. Instinct, grit, fire." Juliette felt something shift inside her, a flicker of pride, but also something warmer, something she wasn't ready to name. She hid it with a smirk. "Careful. You keep saying things like that, and I might start believing I belong here." Preston's eyes locked with hers for a moment too long. Then he turned away and said, "You already do." Over the next week, Juliette became a force of nature inside Whitmore Financial. She streamlined a faltering Asian market investment and proposed a bold restructuring of the logistics arm that stunned the operations team. In a video call with Tokyo, she presented a market realignment plan so precise, the Japanese board agreed to a $50 million injection by the end of the call. Her name, once whispered with doubt in hallway corners, now traveled in sentences laced with awe. But behind the numbers and late nights, something else was blooming. Preston, once unreachable behind layers of cynicism and silence, began to change. He no longer corrected her when she spoke freely, no longer kept his distance when she challenged him. Instead, he leaned in, listened longer, and watched her with eyes that no longer looked cold. One evening, as she struggled with the office printer, Preston appeared beside her, fixed the jam with 2 quick moves, and muttered, "Brilliant with strategy, hopeless with machines. Juliette burst out laughing and retorted, "And you're great with gadgets but terrible with small talk, so we're even." They started staying later, working quietly across from one another, sometimes exchanging jokes between risk forecasts. One night, as Juliette explained how she once dreamed of Wall Street before life tore it away, Preston looked at her, something vulnerable flickering behind his steel blue gaze. "You'll get there," he said. "Not because of me, because you deserve to." She wanted to believe him. And as he returned to his desk, she whispered, just loud enough to hear herself, "Don't get too soft, Mr. Iceberg. I still haven't forgiven you for firing me." He smiled, but said nothing. Because somewhere between reports and regret, power plays and printer jams, something unspoken had begun between them. And neither of them, for the first time in years, was afraid of what came next. The glow from the Manhattan skyline spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Juliette's apartment. But for once, she didn't see it. She sat curled up on the worn couch, still in her office clothes, her heels kicked off, and her hair loosened into soft waves that framed a face etched with fatigue. The success of the Tokyo deal had set off a whirlwind of praise and meetings, and Preston had even, almost, looked proud of her. But none of it mattered tonight. On the coffee table lay a small wooden box, smooth with age, and held shut by a simple brass latch. Her grandmother had given it to her before being admitted to the hospital, whispering, "One day open it, when you're ready to know." Tonight, the hospital called. Her grandmother was gone. Her hands trembled as she opened the box. Inside, nestled in tissue, was a silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon, identical to the one she always wore, though hers was older, duller. Beneath it she found a faded photo, its corners curled with time. A young couple stood smiling, holding two children, one a boy of about 7, the other a girl around 5 with strikingly familiar features. The little girl had wide brown eyes, shoulder-length dark blonde hair, and around her neck, the very same silver pendant. Juliette's blood turned to ice as she stared at the face. She was looking at herself. She clutched the photo, her breath shallow. Her grandmother had never told her anything about her biological family, only that she had been found alone in a public park when she was 5, with no ID, no memory, and no one looking. The woman who raised her, whom she called Grandma, was a retired nurse who took her in and raised her quietly in Philadelphia. The pendant, she said, had come with her. But the girl in this photo, wearing the same necklace, standing with a family that looked too much like pieces of herself, that wasn't a coincidence. That was history surfacing through the cracks of fiction. The next morning, Juliette walked into Whitmore Financial with a storm in her chest and shadows beneath her eyes. She worked through her meetings, eyes focused but mind elsewhere, her answers sharp but hollow. Preston noticed. He asked once, casually, if she was all right, and she replied with a nod that lied. That evening, the boardroom was quiet. Everyone had left except the two of them. She sat at the table, flipping through presentation slides, but she wasn't reading. Preston watched her for a long moment before speaking. "You haven't looked at a single page for 10 minutes, he said, his voice low but clear. "Tell me what's wrong." Juliette hesitated, then slowly reached into her bag and pulled out the photo. She slid it across the table toward him, without a word. Preston picked it up, and the moment his eyes fell on the image, something inside him broke. His face paled, and his fingers tightened around the edges of the photograph. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Juliette's voice was steady, but her hands were not. "It was in a box my grandmother left me. She wasn't my biological grandmother. She found me alone when I was 5. I had no memory, just this necklace." She reached up and touched the crescent pendant at her neck. Preston stood frozen, staring at the photo, as if it had crawled out of a grave. "That girl," he began slowly, "is Lily." His voice cracked. "My sister. She disappeared when I was 7. We were playing in the backyard of our estate in Connecticut. I turned away for 2 minutes. She was gone." My father never recovered. He spent years hiring detectives, offering rewards, and even traveling the country. But nothing. Not a trace. Only the necklace remained. Our mother gave it to her just before she passed away. He looked up, and his eyes met Juliette's. "This photo, this pendant. Juliette, you might be Lily." The silence that followed was deafening. Juliette's breath hitched, her mind reeling. She wanted to laugh, scream, deny it, but everything fit. Her age, her missing years, the necklace, the girl in the photo, and the connection she couldn't explain. Why she'd felt inexplicably drawn to Preston since the day she'd met him, as if her soul remembered something her mind had buried. Her voice shook as she whispered, "If I'm your sister, then everything between us, all of it, is wrong." Preston backed away a step, his jaw clenched. "No, we don't know for sure. It's a coincidence. There could be others, other necklaces, other children who look similar. This doesn't prove anything." But even as he said it, his voice faltered. Juliette stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Her heart felt like it had been wrenched out of her chest. "I need time," she said, grabbing her bag and the photo. "Don't follow me." "Not until we know the truth." She turned and walked out, not looking back, leaving Preston standing in the boardroom with the photo of a little girl who might have come back from the dead and shattered everything he thought he knew. That night, Juliette took the late train out of the city, heading toward nowhere in particular. Her heart throbbed with grief, confusion, and guilt. She didn't cry on the train. She didn't scream. She sat in silence, staring at the pendant in her hand, wondering if the man she had started to love was, by some cruel twist of fate, her brother. Her mind looped over every touch, every glance, every stolen moment between them, and recoiled. She didn't know what hurt more, the thought of losing him, or the thought that she was never allowed to have him in the first place. Back in Manhattan, Preston remained in the boardroom until dawn, staring at the photo that now felt like both proof and a curse. The glass skyline around him reflected only questions. If she were Lily, what did that make him? And if she wasn't, how could he ever be sure? One thing was clear. He had to know the truth. Because if there was even a chance that they weren't bound by blood, then the thing growing between them, slow, fierce, and undeniable, deserved the chance to live. But Juliette was gone, and she had taken with her the only answer that mattered. The morning sun broke over the New York skyline, but inside Preston Whitmore's penthouse, time had stopped. He stood in his study, holding the photograph Juliette had left behind, now slightly creased at the corners from hours of being turned over and over in his hands. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her walking out of that boardroom with a look on her face that had gutted him. Grief, horror, love turning to ash. If Juliette were Lily, his sister, then the feelings growing between them were a sin neither of them had seen coming. But if she wasn't, then he'd let her go based on a lie. He needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them. Mrs. Mildred Shaw, the long-retired housekeeper who had worked for his family when he was a child, lived in upstate Connecticut, in a quiet cottage surrounded by ivy and silence. She had been there the day Lily disappeared. She had held Preston while he cried, helped his father organize search efforts, and eventually vanished into retirement when grief made the house too heavy to breathe in. He hadn't spoken to her in over a decade, but he still had her number. And now, after one brief, shaking call, He was in his car, racing through back roads, the photo of the two children folded into his coat pocket. Mrs. Shaw opened the door before he knocked, as if she had felt him coming. She was older now, slower, her back curved with time, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. She looked at him, then at the tension pulling his face into stone. "It's about Lily," she said, and stepped aside without waiting for his reply. Inside, her living room was warm, cluttered with books and quilts and the scent of something baked with cinnamon. He didn't sit. He couldn't. Instead, he stood near the fireplace and handed her the photo. Her hands trembled slightly as she took it, her breath catching when her eyes found the little girl. "My God," she whispered. She really did survive. Preston's heart slammed against his ribs. "So it is her," he said. "Juliette is Lily," but Mrs. Shaw shook her head, tears pooling in her eyes. "No, child, it's not that simple." She set the photo down gently, like it was sacred. "There's something I've never told anyone. Not your father. Not even the police." She walked to a worn cabinet and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age. "Your father, Augustus. He was a powerful man, but he was also a frightened one. You see, you weren't born into the Whitmore family, Preston. You were adopted." Preston stared at her, every word rearranging the very bones of his identity. "What are you talking about?" he said, his voice hoarse. Mrs. Shaw placed the envelope into his hands. "You were brought to the estate as a baby. Your biological mother was a teenager, scared and sick. Augustus pulled strings to make the adoption private. He wanted an heir after your mother passed, and Lily was still so young. I raised you like you were his, and you were in every way that mattered. But by blood, no, Preston. You and Lily were not related." His knees gave way, and he dropped onto the arm of a chair, the breath knocked out of him. The photo fluttered to the floor. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" he asked. But it wasn't anger. It was disbelief. Mrs. Shaw sat beside him, her voice barely a whisper. "Because he loved you. And because secrets were the mortar that held the Whitmore house together. When Lily disappeared, your father broke down, but he never stopped loving either of you." Preston picked up the envelope again, opening it to reveal adoption papers, hospital forms, a tiny hospital ID bracelet with a name scratched out. Proof. Final. Undeniable. Juliette wasn't his sister. She never had been. Relief surged through him so fast, it left him dizzy. The knot in his chest unraveled, replaced by a burning urgency. He had pushed her away. Again. And this time, he feared it might be too late to pull her back. He stood suddenly, grabbing his coat. "Where is she?" he asked, half to himself. Mrs. Shaw looked at him with quiet understanding. "The girl you described, if she's hurting, she won't go far, but she'll go somewhere kind, somewhere quiet, where people don't ask too many questions." Preston closed his eyes, trying to think like Juliette. Then it came to him. The island she once mentioned in passing, with misty cliffs and wild beaches. A place her grandmother used to take her before the illness. Whidbey Island, Oregon. 3 hours later, Preston was at Teterboro Airport, boarding his jet, adrenaline drowning exhaustion. As the engines roared to life, he stared out the window, not at the sky, but at everything he'd nearly lost to pride and silence. Juliette was not his sister, but she was the only person who had ever truly seen him, and stayed, until he gave her a reason not to. Now, as the plane lifted into the clouds, Preston swore to himself that he'd find her, not just to correct a mistake, but because everything that had gone wrong in his life had started with losing someone he loved. This time, he wouldn't let her slip away, because the truth, once buried, had finally come to light, and with it, a second chance. The plane landed on Whidbey Island, just as a heavy mist rolled in from the sea turning the coastline into a watercolor blur of gray and green. Preston stepped onto the tarmac wearing only a light jacket, his suitcase forgotten in the hold, his mind singularly focused. The cold rain soaked through his shirt within minutes, but he didn't care. He hadn't slept in over a day, hadn't eaten since New York, but adrenaline burned hotter than hunger. He had flown across the country for one reason: to find Juliette, not the strategist, not the maid, not the girl in the photo, just her, the woman who had challenged him, saved him, and broken his heart as she walked away. The local cab driver, a grizzled man with a kind voice, recognized the photo instantly. "She teaches down by the coastal school," he said, chewing a toothpick. "Came in a few days ago asking for volunteer work. Keeps to herself. Doesn't talk much, but the kids love her." Preston paid him double, then walked the last quarter mile on foot. His shoes were soaked, mud splashed up his pants, and the cold was beginning to gnaw at his bones. But none of it mattered. Not when he reached the small, weather-worn schoolhouse perched just above the cliffs, where laughter echoed faintly through the open windows and the wind howled like a secret. Inside, the classroom was alive with color. Children's drawings covered the walls, and mismatched chairs were arranged in loose circles. At the center stood Juliette, her hair tied in a loose braid, her voice soft as she helped a little girl write the letter B in crayon. She looked calm, almost content, but there was a sadness in the way she moved, graceful but weighed down, like her heart no longer floated the way it once had. Preston stood in the doorway, unsure if he should speak, unsure if he even had the right. But as if sensing him, Juliette turned. Their eyes locked. For a long, suspended moment, the world outside ceased to matter. The children, the rain, the wind. There was only the quiet between them. She blinked once, then stepped outside without a word. He followed. The sky had opened by then, rain coming down in thick sheets, but neither of them moved to find cover. They stood facing each other in the downpour, two soaked silhouettes on the edge of a cliff. Preston's voice broke first. "You're not Lily," he said, his words barely louder than the rain. "I found Mrs. Shaw. She told me everything. You were never my sister. I was adopted. It was never you, Juliette. Not by blood. Not by anything that matters." Juliette didn't respond at first. Her eyes searched his face, the storm around them reflecting the one inside her. "You're sure?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because if you're wrong, I don't know if I can survive being broken a second time." Preston took a step closer, his hand rising slowly, but not yet touching her. "I'm sure. I have documents, hospital records, everything. But none of that is why I'm here. I'm here because I let fear push you away, and I can't live with that. You saved my company. You saved me. And then, I let you walk away into the dark without chasing you. That's the only mistake I want to fix." She laughed bitterly, through the tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. "You think just saying the words makes it okay?" she asked, voice cracking. "I've spent every day since wondering if the only man I ever really trusted turned out to be my brother. I hated myself for loving you. Do you know what that does to a person?" He stepped closer, this time gently cupping her face with both hands, his thumbs brushing rain from her skin. "Yes," he whispered. "Because I felt it too. The guilt, the grief, the ache. But none of it was real. What is real is this, you and me, right here, right now." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, she looked like she might collapse into him or run. But then, as thunder cracked across the sky, she whispered, "Then kiss me. If it's real, prove it." He didn't hesitate. His mouth met hers in the pouring rain, fierce and tender all at once. A kiss, not of apology, but of return. It was salt and heat and years of longing packed into seconds, and when they finally broke apart, her forehead rested against his, and both of them were gasping. "I came to find you," he said, brushing soaked strands of hair from her cheek. "Not to fix the company, not to fix me, to find you, the woman who scrubbed marble floors and saw things no one else did, the woman who refused to stay small." Juliette smiled, the first real one in days, and it was radiant through the storm. "Then maybe I was never lost," she murmured. "Maybe I was just waiting for you to see me." The rain kept falling, but they didn't move. There was no longer a need to. For the first time in months, maybe even years, the storm outside matched the storm inside, and both had finally found peace. Preston held her close, and Juliette, no longer running, held him right back. The world would wait. Tonight, they had found their way back to each other, and in the rain, under an open sky, nothing else mattered. The sea was calm that morning, the waves licking the sand like the world itself had taken a breath and held it. Whidbey Island shimmered beneath a pale blue sky. The mist long gone, replaced by golden sunbeams that danced across the water. At the edge of a quiet cove, beneath an archway of driftwood and white roses, Juliette Morgan stood barefoot in a simple ivory gown, the silk moving like light with each step she took. The wind tugged at her veil, but she didn't mind. Her eyes were fixed on the man standing across from her, Preston Whitmore in a charcoal gray suit. His usually sharp expression softened into something almost reverent. Guests sat in rows of wooden chairs set out on the beach, the scent of salt and lilac mingling in the air. Most of them were friends they'd chosen along the way. Teachers from the island school, Preston's closest executive advisors, and a few quiet philanthropists who had supported Juliette's education foundation over the last 6 months. The children she had taught scattered flower petals along the aisle, their laughter ringing out like music. There were no reporters, no board members, no cameras, just people who mattered, and a love that had survived fire, fear, and fate. The ceremony was short. Neither of them believed in spectacle for the sake of spectacle. But when Preston took her hand, his voice steady but thick with emotion, there was not a dry eye on the beach. He spoke of second chances and how she had become his first real home. She spoke of broken beginnings and how through him, she had learned that love did not demand perfection, only presence. Their vows were promises wrapped in quiet understanding, forged not in fantasy, but in the trenches of real life. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, Preston kissed her like the world was brand new. And for them, it was. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the ocean turned gold, they walked the shoreline hand in hand, away from the music and clinking glasses, past the torches flickering in the sand. The wind carried the scent of firewood and sweet wine, and Juliette leaned into Preston's shoulder, her fingers interlaced with his. "I never thought I'd wear white," she said with a teasing smile. "Or that the man beside me would once have me mopping his marble stairs," Preston laughed, the sound low and unguarded. "I never thought the girl who ruined my floor wax would rebuild my entire life," he replied, squeezing her hand. "But here we are." As they reached the far edge of the beach, they stopped near an old cedar tree, where a wooden bench sat overlooking the sea. It was there, resting on the bench as if waiting, that Juliette noticed something wrapped in oilskin. Curious, she knelt and unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a leather-bound journal, worn and water-stained, its pages filled with looping script. The initials on the cover, A.W., froze them both. Augustus Whitmore, Preston's father. He took the journal from her slowly, opening it to a folded page marked with a pressed violet. The entry was dated only days after Lily disappeared, and it read like a confession. Augustus had written of his grief, of his fear, that he had lost not just one child but both. He spoke of Preston's adoption, of his guilt in keeping the truth buried, of the legacy he had tried to build not from empire, but from emptiness. Then, on the final page, he had written of a fund, one he had hidden away from the board and media alike, meant for children like Lily, like Preston, like Juliette, a trust for the forgotten. "If I cannot save my children," he had written, "then let what remains of me save others." Juliette's fingers trembled as she traced the ink. Preston read in silence, the weight of the words pressing deep. The fund had never been used. It still existed, hidden behind shell accounts and quiet trusts. With a nod from her, they both knew what they would do. The next morning, the papers were signed. The fund was renamed the Whitmore Morgan Foundation for Lost and Found Children. Its mission was simple: support education, provide shelter, and find those who had been forgotten by a world too busy to notice them disappear. Back in New York months later, Juliette stood on the stage of the foundation's inaugural gala, no longer a maid, no longer a mystery, but a woman in command of her life and purpose. Preston stood beside her, not as the billionaire mogul she once scrubbed floors for, but as her partner, in business, in cause, in love. Together, they spoke of journeys through grief, of identity, of the power of second chances, and the beauty of courage. And when she looked at him, truly looked at him, it was not the man she once feared, or even the one she fell for, but the one she had built something with, brick by brick, mistake by mistake. As the crowd rose in applause, Juliette whispered, "We found something bigger than a company. We found meaning." Preston smiled, then leaned in and whispered back, "And I found you." The legacy they left was not one of wealth, but of resilience. Not of stock charts, but of stories. Not of empires built in glass towers, but of hearts rebuilt in silence and rain. And so the Maid became the founder. The tycoon became a believer. And the island that once held their storm became the shore where their story began again. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey of love, resilience, and second chances. If Juliette and Preston's story touched your heart, inspired you, or made you reflect, don't keep it to yourself. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us your favorite moment, or rate the story from 0 to 10. Your voice matters here. Until next time, stay brave, stay kind, and never stop believing in the power of a new beginning. See you in the next story, in the next.